Real estate prices go down. So the banks are going to fail if the Fed raises rates to fight the inflation. A lot of the banks that got bailed out are going to fail. What about the government? I already mentioned earlier that the government has got this, all this debt short term. What would happen if interest rates rose on the national debt? I mean, what happened if rates went up to 5% or 7%? Well, all of a sudden you triple the net interest payments on the national debt. What happens if we have to pay $700 billion, $800 billion, maybe $1 trillion a year in interest payments on national debt? How can we afford that? We can't. I mean, we would have to impose the same type of haircut that the Greeks got. In fact, there might not even be a crew cut, but we'd have to put on our creditors to actually make these payments. So if the Fed has to raise interest rates, the party's over. It's a bigger collapse than we had. So the Fed doesn't want to do that. So what is the Fed going to do? The Fed is going to try to pretend that there's no inflation, pretend that, it's going to come back down. I mean, the Fed is already claiming that now. The last time Ben Bernanke spoke, he said that, the inflationary pressures are transitory, prices are already coming down, we expect the inflation to cool. Based on what? Prices are still rising. So oil is up 20% in the last month, and he's talking about prices coming down. They're not coming down. I mean, maybe he's hoping that they come down. It's wishful thinking. But I don't know what he's basing his forecast on. It can't be on his track record. It's like, I've done such a good job of forecasting in the past that I'm just going to go out on a limb here with this one. I mean, he's gotten all of the major trends wrong. When there was a housing bubble, he was at the top of the bubble. He said there was no bubble. Even after it had burst, he said it didn't exist. And then he said, it's not going to hurt the economy. And it's not going to affect employment. Got it wrong. And of course, remember when the mortgage crisis first began, he was the one that was saying that don't worry about it. It's contained. It's not a problem. It's contained to subprime. Don't worry about it. It's interesting that's the same thing they're saying about sovereign debt crisis in Europe. Don't worry about it. It's contained. Right? It's contained over there in Europe. It's not going to affect America. Of course, it's going to affect America. We got the same problem. They're just working their way up the food chain. This is when the sovereigns that have borrowed too much money are having their day of reckoning. It's not going to skip America. We're still going to have to deal with this. And in fact, one of the reasons that a lot of people are saying that we're not Greece is because they'll say we have a printing press and Greece doesn't. That's the problem. We got that printing press. And we use that printing press. Greece doesn't have that option. We do, and that's unfortunate. Because we're going to wipe out our debt through inflation. Because that's ultimately the problem. What this crisis is going to come down to is the bondholders, the creditors, are not going to get paid. One way or another, they're going to lose. Either we're going to default, like the Greeks are doing. Either we default and you don't get your money back, or we inflate and you get your money back, but you can't buy anything with it. Those are the only two options. Because actually paying off the debt with legitimate money is not even a possibility. That option is not even on the table. So if Ben Bernanke doesn't raise rates because he's so afraid of what that's going to do to this phony economy, if he keeps rates down, even though inflation is rising, even though the dollar is falling, if he still pretends that that's not the case, that's when you get the crisis. That's when you get a currency crisis, because now it's out of the bag. Everybody knows that it's all bark, it's no bite, that the Fed is just going to keep printing inflation, that the dollar is going to be sacrificed, and then nobody is going to want to own any debts denominated in dollars. That's when you get a run from the dollar, not a flight to the dollar. And now the inflation really starts to pick up. And now if Ben Bernanke feels pressure now to monetize even more, they call it quantitative easing now. They don't want to just call it inflation or debt monetization, because quantitative easing doesn't sound quite as bad as we're creating inflation. But if they're going to do that, well, now they have to start buying all the bonds. Because it's not just treasuries that are under pressure, it's the municipal bonds, it's the corporate bonds. Because who's going to want to own a bond with a coupon of 5% or 6% if inflation is 10% or 15%? Nobody's going to want to own them. And so now the Fed is under pressure to monetize even more debt. But of course, the more debt it monetizes, the less the money is worth, because it just creates thin air. And you've also got our foreign creditors who have been buying, the lion's share of our debt auctions. They're going to wise up. They're going to stop doing it. Now, a lot of people will tell me, I get into arguments with people because they say, look, the Chinese are never going to stop buying our bonds. Well, what do you mean? Well, they own too many. They can't afford to stop because they're going to lose a lot of money on the dollars they have. I said, well, yeah, I mean, but they've already lost that money because we can't pay it back. They got to know that. And eventually what the Chinese are going to be thinking about is not the $2 trillion in treasuries that they already have, but the $10 trillion that they're going to have if they keep it up. And then they're going to start to worry about all that good money thrown after bad and how much more they're going to lose. And the Chinese eventually are going to have to figure out that the more money they loan to America, the less likely it is they get any of it back. And so at some point they're going to have to bite the bullet. Because they know the politics are going to be very dangerous for the Chinese. And of course we've already kind of let the cat out of the bag on this when we had our discussions surrounding the debt ceiling. Remember when we were toying with the idea of not raising the debt ceiling? What did the president say? What did the secretary of the Treasury say? The secretary said, well, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to have to default. That's not a very smart thing to say, especially when yeah, we can't pay, but it's not a good idea to actually let our creditors know that we're not going to pay them. Because it's not like Obama said, hey, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, don't worry, your treasuries are safe. We're going to cut Social Security. We're going to cut back on national defense. We're going to prioritize interest on the national debt. No, they said, if you got a U.S. bond, you're the low man on the totem pole. That's the first thing that's going to go. We're not going to pay the national debt. I mean, that is as close as you're going to get to an official admission that we're running a Ponzi scheme. Because that's what it is. What did we say? We said if we can't borrow more money, then we're not going to pay back what we've already borrowed. Well, that's telling our creditors. Because remember, the debt ceiling is our own limits. That's where we say this is as much as we're willing to borrow. Well, of course, that was a bluff. Because we'll borrow as much as people are dumb enough to lend us. But what the foreigners are now thinking is, wait a minute. So if we decide that we don't want to roll that debt over anymore, if the Chinese decide, we got all these treasury bills, you owe us $3 trillion, we don't want to lend you anymore. Just, can we have the $3 trillion back? We just told them what we're going to say. No! You can't. If you want to loan us another $1 trillion, okay, but we're not going to give you back the money you've already borrowed. We told them that. Because we can't give it back. Right? It's one big Ponzi scheme, because every time a bond matures, the only way we can pay off the holder is if we borrow the money to do it. And whenever it comes time to pay interest, where do we get the money? We borrow it. We don't have it. And the Chinese know. And of course, the more the Chinese own, the less likely it is that they're going to pay. You see all of the protests in Greece because the Greeks don't want to have to sacrifice some of their benefits to make payments to German banks. And I don't blame them. Why would you want to bail out German banks? Well, imagine the riots. I mean, you think we got problems now with Occupy Wall Street. Imagine what's going to happen if the president were to say, we need to cut back on our Social Security benefits. We got to cut back on our unemployment compensation. We got to cut back on welfare because we got a big interest payment coming to the Chinese. And they want their money, and we're good for our debts. I mean, there's no way. I mean, the Chinese know if it's cut Social Security or stop paying interest on the national debt, because the Chinese can't even vote. Why is an American politician going to care what the Chinese say when they can't vote? Right? They're going to tell a voter that you can't have your Social Security benefit because we got to pay the Saudis. We got to pay. So they know this. So they're looking out. They don't want to lend any more money. So this is the crisis. It's not the sovereign debt crisis. It's not a Greek problem or an Ireland problem. It's a U.S. problem. That's where this all ends. And when we have our sovereign debt crisis, when the dollar's collapsing and the treasury market is collapsing, there's no bailout. Right? The government bailed out all the banks, but now it's the government that needs to be bailed out, and there's no one who can do the bailing. Right? There's no rescue plan. That's it. And then we have one or two things that are going to happen. When everything starts to fall apart, the Fed is going to then finally say, okay, we've got to slam on the brakes. We've got to jack interest rates way up. Not just a little bit. They're going to have to go very, very high. And then it's just going to be a complete wreck. Right? And that's under this scenario, right? Because if we raise interest rates dramatically, not only do we have to let a lot of banks fail, not only do we have to let the bondholders lose money, because last time all the bondholders came out whole, right? Next time the bondholders, not only the bondholders are going to lose, but the depositors are going to lose. The government's going to have to tell people who have bank accounts, you're out of luck. You put your money in this bank and it just failed and the FDIC is broke, so you lost your money. The government's going to have to tell people, hey, we can't make these Social Security payments. And the government's going to have to tell bondholders, you're not going to get your money back. We don't have it. Because if interest rates go up, we can't pay. If interest rates go to 10%, let's say they got to 10%, when the national debt was at 20 trillion, which it could be in a couple of years. That means we'd have to pay $2 trillion a year in interest payments on the national debt. Is that even possible? That's like 100% of the tax revenue. And of course, would the government even have any tax revenues if interest rates were 20%? Oh, there'd be no economy left. Who are they going to tax? So, the numbers don't work. So if the Federal Reserve does the right thing and raises interest rates, they're going to have to let banks fail, let the government default, let depositors lose money, let this whole phony house of cards economy that has been built up on cheap money and endless credit and consumption, it's all going to come tumbling down. And that's the good scenario. If we do that, then we did the right thing. If the Federal Reserve, if they don't want that, if they're too scared of that, then it's just, well, we'll just keep on printing. We can't let that happen. And then we destroy the dollar, and then the dollar is worthless. And then so the depositors get all their money, but they can't buy anything with it. And that is a much bigger disaster than just allowing the deflation, allowing people to lose money, because at least the money they don't lose will have value. At least if we cut a deal with our creditors and pay them 30 cents on the dollar, they'll have 30 cents, in real money. That's better than getting monopoly money, which is what they're going to get if we don't default, if we try to pretend. If we try to pretend that everybody can get their Social Security benefits, then nobody gets any benefits, because the benefits will have no value. But this decision is coming soon. This is not a decade